Ryan Carter stood before the iron gates of a vast estate in the cold rain, a sealed envelope pressed between both hands, carrying every dollar he had saved across 7 years of careful, grinding work. He had come to repay the final debt he owed the woman who had quietly saved his life on the darkest day he had ever known. The rain had soaked through his jacket by the time the gate finally buzzed open, but he did not move right away. He looked up at the towering facade of the Sterling estate, at the lit windows that seemed to belong to a world entirely unlike his own, and he steadied himself the way he always did before something difficult. When Ryan placed the envelope on the table between them later that evening, Madison Sterling did not reach for it. She studied him for a long, unhurried moment, then pushed it back across the polished surface and made an offer that left him standing in silence, unable to speak. If he accepted, his entire life would be rewritten. If he refused, he might lose the one thing he had spent years trying to rebuild. Stay with this story, because what Madison Sterling offered that night was something no amount of money could have prepared Ryan Carter to receive. Ryan's days began before 5 in the morning and ended well after dark. His repair shop, Carter Mechanical, sat on a cracked stretch of industrial road just outside Millbrook, and it had been his anchor for 6 years, the thing that kept him grounded after everything else had collapsed. The shop smelled of motor oil and welding flux, and its walls were hung with half-finished project notes written in his own careful handwriting. He had built the business from almost nothing, starting with 2 used lifts, a second-hand compressor, and a loan from his older brother that he repaid within 18 months. His employees, 3 of them, knew that Ryan never asked anyone to do something he was not willing to do himself, and they respected him for it in the uncomplicated, quiet way that working people often respect competence. His daughter, Sophie, was 9 years old and already knew the name of every tool in the shop because Ryan had made a point of teaching her. He was not the kind of man who had ever wanted to be remarkable. He simply wanted to be reliable, and for a long time that had been enough. But 7 years before this particular rain-soaked evening, Ryan Carter had been none of those things. The company he had worked for, a mid-sized logistics firm called Hartwell Distribution, had collapsed under the weight of its own fraudulent accounting, and 200 employees, Ryan among them, had found themselves without income almost overnight. His wife, Dana, had been quietly unhappy for years, and the financial collapse gave her the language and the permission to finally say what she had long been thinking. She left within 3 months, taking very little and leaving Ryan alone in a rented house with a 2-year-old daughter and a checking account that would not cover the following month's rent. He had tried to stay functional, tried to manage the grief and the panic and the sheer logistical weight of single parenthood, but the effort cost him in ways he could not always see. On a Tuesday in November, driving home from a failed job interview in the rain, his car had been struck from behind at an intersection and rolled partially onto its side. He had not been seriously hurt, but the adrenaline and the weeks of accumulated exhaustion had collapsed something inside him, and by the time the paramedics arrived, he was in a bad way. He spent 2 nights in the hospital, his daughter cared for by a neighbor, his medical bills accumulating in a tray he did not have the courage to look at. When he was discharged, a hospital administrator told him quietly that his outstanding balance had been settled by an anonymous party. Ryan had stared at the woman for a full 10 seconds before asking her to repeat herself. He had never learned who had done it, not right away, not for many years. But he had made a private promise, standing in the cold of the hospital parking lot with his discharge papers folded under his arm, that one day he would find out and he would repay every dollar. The envelope contained $42,000, which was the amount he had calculated with interest, compounded conservatively over the years since the payment had been made. Ryan had researched Madison Sterling's name through a series of small, persistent inquiries over the preceding 12 months. He had found her name in a hospital foundation donor record, cross-referenced it with a subsequent news item about Sterling Holdings, and confirmed what he suspected through a conversation with a former Millbrook Hospital administrator who no longer had reason to maintain confidentiality. It had taken him the better part of a year. He had not told anyone what he was doing, not even his brother, because the impulse was too personal to describe without sounding unusual. He drove to the Sterling estate in his 12-year-old pickup truck, parked it on the gravel sweep in front of the main entrance, and walked to the door in the rain. The woman who opened the door was not Madison Sterling. She was Olivia Harper, the household manager, a composed and observant woman in her late 50s who had worked for the Sterling family for more than 2 decades. She looked at Ryan with the particular attentiveness of someone who had learned, through long experience, to read visitors before they spoke. Something shifted in her expression when she took him in, Not surprise, exactly, but recognition, as though she had been told to expect someone matching his general description and had been privately curious about whether he would actually appear. She invited him into the entrance hall and asked him to wait, and Ryan stood with the envelope in his hands, looking at the oil portraits and the high ceilings and the kind of quiet that comes only from very large, very old houses. Olivia returned after a few minutes and led him down a corridor to a sitting room where Madison Sterling was waiting. Madison was younger looking than Ryan had expected, though he could not have said what he had expected. She was composed in a way that seemed entirely natural, as though she had been born into the particular posture of someone accustomed to being the most capable person in a room. She stood when he entered, extended her hand, and thanked him for making the drive out. Her eyes were direct and her manner was warm, without being performative, and Ryan found himself off balance in a way he could not immediately account for. He introduced himself, stated his purpose plainly, and placed the envelope on the low table between the two chairs she indicated they should use. He thanked her for what she had done 7 years ago, told her that it had allowed him to get back on his feet, and explained that he had spent those years building a stable life for himself and his daughter. He said all of this carefully and without excess, the way he said most things. Madison listened without interrupting, her expression attentive and genuinely warm. When Ryan finished, there was a silence of several seconds. Then Madison Sterling reached forward and pushed the envelope back toward him. She said she did not need the money. Ryan opened his mouth to object, and she raised one hand very slightly, not sharply, but with a quiet authority that made clear she had something further to say. She asked about Sophie, which caught him completely off guard because he had not mentioned his daughter's name. She asked how the shop was doing, whether he had expanded, whether the rental on the industrial space was workable in the current market. Ryan answered each question carefully, watching her, trying to understand what was happening. He had prepared for this meeting in the same methodical way he prepared for everything. He had considered the possibility that she would refuse the money and had planned his response accordingly. But what Madison Sterling was doing now did not resemble any version of events he had imagined. She was not simply being generous. She was studying him, with the focused attention of someone conducting an evaluation, and the questions she asked were not casual at all. When she finally set down her tea and looked at him with the full measure of her attention, Madison said something that made the room feel slightly smaller. She told Ryan that she had been watching his progress for some time. Not intrusively, she said, but deliberately. She had followed the development of Carter Mechanical through business registry filings and local press coverage. She knew the names of his employees. She knew that he had turned down a buyout offer from a regional auto chain 2 years ago because the offer required him to let 2 of his 3 people go. She said she had wanted to confirm something, that the man she had quietly helped 7 years ago was the same man she believed him to be. Then she told him that she had a proposal for him and that she hoped he would hear it fully before responding. The proposal was this: Ryan Carter would join Sterling Holdings in a newly created advisory role attached to a classified internal restructuring project. The compensation was, by any measure Ryan applied, extraordinary, a figure he would have considered implausible if he had heard it described at second hand. The authority he would hold within the project was real, not ceremonial. Madison explained the general outlines of what the project involved: a review of operational systems across 3 of the company's subsidiary divisions, with a focus on identifying inefficiencies and undisclosed liabilities. She wanted someone with practical knowledge, she said, someone who understood the difference between what a spreadsheet claimed and what was actually happening on a shop floor. Ryan was quiet for a long time after she finished. Then Madison Sterling said something else. She said that the money on the table was not, in any case, what she most wanted to give him. Ryan looked at her without answering. She did not elaborate. The silence between them had a quality that Ryan Carter could not name and did not entirely understand, and it stayed with him for the entire drive home through the rain. The first morning Ryan arrived at Sterling Holdings headquarters, he felt the particular self-consciousness of a man who has spent his career working with his hands, walking into a building full of people who have spent theirs working with language and numbers. The headquarters occupied the upper 12 floors of a glass and steel building in the city's financial district, and everything about it communicated a kind of controlled ambition. The lobby art, the conference room furniture, the way the receptionist greeted visitors with exactly calibrated warmth. Madison's assistant, a brisk young man named Trevor, met Ryan at the elevator bank and walked him through an orientation that covered access protocols, confidentiality agreements, and the organizational chart of the restructuring project. Ryan signed the documents, asked 3 clarifying questions that seemed to surprise Trevor slightly, and was shown to a glass-walled office 2 floors below Madison's that was considerably larger and better equipped than anything he had ever worked in. He spent the first week reading every operational report, every logistics audit, every subsidiary revenue filing that the project scope covered. He went through all of it methodically, the way he went through a diagnostic on a car he had never worked on before, looking not for what the documents said but for what they were reluctant to say. By the 3rd day, he had already identified 2 patterns that seemed worth attention. By the 5th day, he had a name: Ethan Brooks. Brooks was the company's chief operating officer, a tall, expensively suited man in his early 40s who moved through the building with the ease of someone who had long since concluded that he owned the place. Ryan had seen the type before, in the logistics firm that had collapsed, in the general management layer of every company he had ever dealt with. The man who accumulated authority by controlling information rather than by generating value. Brooks was never unfriendly to Ryan. He was, in fact, unusually pleasant, which Ryan noted with the same quiet attention he gave to everything else. What Ryan noticed in the data was a pattern of intercompany transfers that were structured to look like routine operational expenses, but that, when traced through the subsidiary ledgers, did not produce any corresponding operational output. Small sums, in themselves unremarkable but recurring with a regularity that was not consistent with any business rhythm he could identify. He noted the amounts, the dates, the account codes. He said nothing to anyone. On the 8th day, a junior analyst named Patricia Voss left a sealed folder on his desk while he was away from the office. Inside was a printed summary of transactions, annotated in a hand he did not recognize, with a note clipped to the cover sheet that said only, "You are looking in the right place." Ryan locked the folder in his desk drawer and sat for a while in the quiet of the empty office, listening to the building settle around him. The evidence he assembled over the following 3 weeks was careful and thorough. It covered 4 years of activity across 2 subsidiaries and 1 internal fund, and it indicated that somewhere between $9 and $14 million had been redirected from Sterling Holdings accounts into a series of financial structures that bore no relationship to any disclosed business purpose. Every trail, when Ryan followed it to its source, led back to Ethan Brooks, to decisions Brooks had made, approvals he had granted, and instructions he had issued. Some of the transfers had required the cooperation of mid-level finance staff, who had apparently understood they were being asked to do something irregular, but had lacked either the standing or the courage to refuse. The picture was not ambiguous. It was simply incomplete in its most recent phase because Brooks had become more careful in the past 12 months. Ryan brought his findings to Madison on a Thursday evening when the building was mostly empty. He laid the documents on her desk in a sequence that told the story plainly, and he walked her through the logic without embellishment. Madison listened with the concentrated stillness of someone who is hearing something they had suspected for a long time. When he finished, she was quiet for a full minute. Then she told him that what he had found was consistent with concerns she had raised internally 2 years ago and been told by the company's previous auditors were not material. She said she had known something was wrong. She said she had not been able to prove it to the satisfaction of the board, and that her inability to do so had cost her credibility with several directors who were already, for reasons she had not yet fully identified, more sympathetic to Brooks than to her. She thanked Ryan for his work with a directness that he found more meaningful than formal praise. In the weeks that followed, something changed in the texture of their working relationship. The formality that had characterized their early conversations loosened without quite disappearing, replaced by the comfortable directness of 2 people who have discovered they think about problems in compatible ways. They worked late several times a week, eating takeout in the conference room adjoining Madison's office, talking through the restructuring project in terms that gradually expanded to include larger questions about what the company was for and what its responsibilities were to the people who worked within it. Ryan learned that Madison had taken over Sterling Holdings from her father, Victor, 6 years ago, under circumstances that had been more fraught than the public record suggested. Victor Sterling was a man of considerable ability who had built his company through a combination of genuine vision and a willingness to be ruthless in ways that had sometimes been costly to the people around him. Madison had grown up in his shadow, had spent her young adulthood learning to meet his standards, and had arrived at her current position with the skills and the exhaustion of someone who had been performing under assessment for her entire life. She was, Ryan noticed, almost entirely alone in the personal sense, surrounded by employees, advisors, and social obligations, and essentially without anyone who knew her as a person rather than as a position. He noticed this without drawing attention to it. He simply continued showing up, doing the work, and being exactly who he was, which, he was beginning to understand, was more unusual in Madison Sterling's world than it had ever been in his. There was a particular kind of loneliness, he had come to think, that attended positions of significant authority, not the loneliness of having no one around, but the loneliness of having everyone around for reasons that had nothing to do with you. He had experienced a version of that in the years after Dana left, when the people who had known him as part of a couple had slowly redistributed into other patterns, and he had been left with a social landscape of acquaintances and professional contacts, and very little that qualified as friendship in any demanding sense. He had adjusted. He had built his days around Sophie and the shop and the occasional evening with his brother, and he had told himself, in the way that capable solitary people often do, that it was enough. Watching Madison Sterling navigate the same condition inside the glass walls of an institution she had spent her adult life building, Ryan felt something that was neither pity nor simple recognition but something more precise, the particular acknowledgement of one survivor for another. Then Ethan Brooks made his move. Ryan had been at the company for just under 2 months when he found the preliminary documentation for what appeared to be a major undisclosed acquisition. A transaction that, if completed at the valuations Brooks had arranged, would transfer effective control of Sterling Holdings' most profitable division to a holding company in which Brooks himself held a significant undisclosed stake. The transaction was structured to be approved by a 4-member subcommittee of the board, 3 of whom, Ryan's subsequent research suggested, had received substantial personal financial benefits in connection with prior Brooks initiatives. The timeline indicated the vote was scheduled for 12 days from the date of the documents Ryan had recovered. He went directly to Madison. Madison's response was immediate and cold in the way that genuine alarm sometimes presents itself. She recognized the names of the 3 board members as people Brooks had been cultivating for years. She understood the mechanism of the transaction. She also understood that the moment she moved openly against Brooks, he would use every asset at his disposal, including his relationship with Victor Sterling, with whom he had maintained a carefully constructed friendship, to discredit whatever she put forward. That evening, Ryan briefed Madison's legal counsel, a precise and careful woman named Sandra Cole, who confirmed that Ryan's analysis was structurally sound and that the transaction, if completed, would likely constitute a breach of fiduciary duty that could expose several parties to significant liability. Sandra also told them both that confirming the full picture would require additional documentation that they did not yet have. The counterattack came before Ryan expected it. Someone, he never confirmed who, provided a financial journalist with a version of his biography that emphasized his business failures of 7 years ago, his lack of corporate credentials, and the suggestion that a man with his background had been placed in a senior role at Sterling Holdings for reasons that had nothing to do with his professional qualifications. The story ran in an industry publication under a headline that stopped just short of stating its implication directly. The board members who were already skeptical of Madison used the coverage as a reason to schedule a formal inquiry into the hiring decision. Ethan Brooks expressed concern in a board communication that was carefully calibrated to sound neutral about the due diligence process that had led to Ryan's appointment. Several employees who had been friendly to Ryan in the corridors became suddenly and noticeably formal. His access to 2 secondary systems was quietly restricted without explanation. Trevor, Madison's assistant, told him on a Thursday morning that a scheduled meeting with the divisional finance heads had been postponed and that he would receive a new date in due course. Ryan recognized these signals for what they were, not a frontal challenge, but a methodical erosion, the kind designed to accumulate pressure until the target removed himself voluntarily. He had seen the pattern before, in the last months at Hartwell Distribution, when the people who knew the company was failing had begun, individually and without coordination, to quietly reduce their exposure. It was a distinctly human behavior, and understanding it did not make it any less effective. Victor Sterling, who sat on the advisory board and whose opinion carried weight with several directors, called Madison and asked her, in the measured tone he used when he was genuinely unsatisfied, whether she had considered the reputational implications of her association with someone whose background had not been more thoroughly vetted. Madison listened to her father in silence and then told him she would call him back. She did not call him back that evening. Ryan sat across from Madison in her office after the board communication had circulated and offered to step away from the project. He said it without self-pity. It was simply a logical possibility, might reduce the pressure on her, and he was willing to accept that outcome. He said this in the same matter-of-fact tone he used when describing a repair estimate. Madison looked at him for a moment without speaking, and then she said something that Ryan Carter had not expected from anyone in a very long time. She said no. She said it simply and without elaboration, in a tone that made clear the matter was settled. It was the first time anyone in Madison Sterling's professional life had looked at her while she was under institutional pressure and stayed anyway. The evening Madison told Ryan the full story. They were alone in the conference room after everyone else had gone home. She had been carrying the account for 7 years without telling it to anyone, and the act of saying it aloud seemed to surprise her slightly, the way that suppressed things sometimes register their own release. She told him that the afternoon she had seen him in the hospital was not, in fact, the first time she had encountered him. 3 weeks before the accident, on a cold morning in November, she had seen a man in a parking garage near the city center stop beside someone who had collapsed near the stairwell. The collapsed man was in his 50s, poorly dressed, and in obvious distress. Madison had seen other people pass by without slowing. The man who stopped had knelt down, placed his jacket over the collapsed man's shoulders, called for emergency services, and then stayed, sitting beside a stranger on a concrete floor, talking to him quietly, until the paramedics arrived. He had been late for wherever he was going. He had not seemed to consider any other option. Madison had not spoken to him. She had not known his name. But she had thought about what she had seen with a regularity that surprised her over the weeks that followed, because it was the kind of unremarked-upon goodness that she had come, in her professional life, to regard as genuinely rare. When she encountered Ryan Carter in the hospital 3 weeks later, she had recognized him immediately. She had not approached him, because she had understood that approaching him would change the nature of what she was able to give. She had settled his bills through the hospital foundation, anonymously, and had thought about him periodically in the years afterward with the particular quality of attention one gives to things that cannot be resolved. Ryan was quiet for a long time after she finished. He had not known that anyone had seen him that morning. He had not thought of it as a notable act. He had simply been unable to walk past a person in distress, which had always seemed to him like a fairly ordinary human threshold to meet. Understanding that it had been observed and that the observation had set in motion a chain of events that had led directly to this room, this company, this conversation, produced a quality of vertigo that he could not fully account for. He thought about his daughter, about the years of work that had followed the accident, about the accumulating series of small choices that had built Carter Mechanical from nothing. He thought about all the ways things might have gone differently, and he understood for the first time that he had not been building his life in isolation. Someone had been paying attention. He began to understand why Madison Sterling had brought him here, and it was not only because of his capacity for investigation. The timeline compressed in the final week. Ryan had obtained, through Patricia Voss and 2 other sources he was careful not to expose, a complete set of wire transfer records showing the full scope of Brooks's redirected funds across the preceding 4 years. The total came to slightly over $11 million, channeled through 4 separate holding vehicles and ultimately distributed to accounts registered in Brooks's name and in the names of 2 board members who had been among his most consistent allies. Sandra Cole had spent 3 days reviewing the documentation and had confirmed that it constituted sufficient basis for both a civil action and a referral to the relevant regulatory authority. The board vote on the acquisition was now 4 days away. Ryan received a call at 11 on a Tuesday night from his shop manager, a steady man named Danny Reese, telling him that Carter Mechanical had flooded. The rear wall of the shop had sustained structural damage, and the fire department's preliminary assessment was that the cause had been a deliberate water main breach at the adjacent property, which was nominally vacant. 2 of Ryan's 3 lifts were under 18 inches of water. His parts inventory was a total loss. He drove to the shop in the dark and stood in the wreckage of the thing he had built, in the smell of standing water and ruined machinery, and he allowed himself 60 seconds of something that was not quite grief and not quite anger but partook of both. Then he called Danny, told him to secure the premises and go home, and stood alone in the flooded shop for a while longer, thinking. He was still standing there, in the cold and the dark, when headlights swept through the broken bay door. Madison Sterling stepped out of a black car and walked through the standing water in shoes that were entirely wrong for it, without appearing to notice or care. She looked at the damage and then she looked at Ryan, and something in her expression was very different from anything he had seen from her in the weeks they had worked together. She said she was sorry. She said it in a tone that made clear she understood the magnitude of what had been destroyed and was not offering the apology as a social formality. She had driven herself, Ryan noticed. There was no second person in the car, no security detail, no assistant. She had come alone at midnight to stand in the wreckage of a mechanic's shop because she understood, in a way that she did not explain and did not need to, that this was what was required. She looked around at the waterlogged machinery, the ruined inventory, the filing cabinet with its drawers warped open from the moisture, and she did not try to minimize it or redirect towards solutions. She simply stayed. Ryan looked at her standing in the water and the dark, and the wreckage of the shop he had built with 7 years of work, and something shifted in the structure of the distance he had maintained between them since the first evening in her sitting room. He told her it could be rebuilt. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without theater, as a statement of fact. Madison looked at him for a moment and then said that she knew. They worked through what remained of the night in Ryan's kitchen, with the documentation spread across the table and Sandra Cole on the phone, finalizing the presentation that would be delivered to the full Sterling Holdings Board of Directors at the emergency session Madison had called for the following morning. Ryan's evidence was organized into 3 sequential components: the historic transfers, the acquisition structure, and the documentary proof of the 2 board members' financial involvement. Sandra had coordinated with an outside regulatory counsel who was prepared to file simultaneously with the board presentation. Victor Sterling, who had been briefed the previous evening by Madison in a conversation of considerable candor, had agreed to attend the session and to hear the evidence before forming a conclusion. He had not told Madison whether he believed her. He had simply said he would come. The board session lasted 3.5 hours. Ethan Brooks was present for the first 90 minutes, and he performed his denial with genuine skill. He was, Ryan reflected, a man of considerable ability who had simply applied it to the wrong ends. But the documentation was complete, the regulatory referral had already been filed, and the 2 compromised board members had received notice that morning from their own legal counsel that cooperation would materially affect their personal exposure. The vote, when it came, was not close. Brooks resigned his position before the session formally adjourned. He was escorted from the building. The 2 board members announced their own departures within the week. Victor Sterling, walking out of the boardroom beside Ryan in the emptying hallway, stopped and looked at him with the directness of a man who does not often revise his assessments and is not entirely comfortable doing so now. He said that Madison had shown unusual judgment in the people she trusted. He did not apologize for his earlier skepticism. Victor Sterling was not a man who apologized easily, but he extended his hand and Ryan shook it, and the thing that passed between them in that hallway was as clear and as sufficient as a handshake between 2 people who understand each other. Ryan spent the week that followed returning to the rhythms of his ordinary life, coordinating the insurance assessment on the shop, arranging temporary space through a contact at a neighboring facility, working through the damage inventory with Danny and the other 2 employees whose patience and loyalty through the disruption had reminded him, not for the first time, of what was actually valuable about the thing he had built. Sophie came to the temporary space after school and sat on a toolbox doing her homework while Ryan and Danny worked, and Ryan looked at her once from across the floor and felt the particular satisfaction of a life that has been examined and found adequate. He had been prepared to return to all of this completely and without regret. He had done what Madison needed. The debt was settled, the work was finished, and he was at peace with the boundary between her world and his. Madison called him on a Friday evening and asked if he would come by the estate. She said there was something she wanted to say to him in person. Ryan parked on the gravel sweep, walked to the door in a clear autumn evening that smelled nothing like the rain of his first visit, and Olivia Harper met him with a warmth in her expression that she made no effort to conceal. She brought him to the same sitting room where he had first placed the envelope on the table 6 weeks before, and Madison was waiting in the same chair, in the same composed posture, but with something different in her manner, an openness that had not been present in that first meeting, as though she had made a decision and was no longer expending effort on maintaining alternatives. She told him that she owed him an honest accounting. She said that the medical bills 7 years ago had not been the act of an anonymous philanthropist, but a deliberate choice made by someone who had recognized, in a hospital corridor, a man worth the investment. She said that the advisory role had been real. She had genuinely needed his skills and his judgment, but that it had also been something else, something she had not been entirely prepared to name at the outset because she had been uncertain whether she was right about him, and because being wrong would have cost her something she could not afford to lose. She had spent 7 years managing an institution that demanded everything from her and offered in return only the continued permission to go on managing it. She had been excellent at it. She had not been happy. Then she asked Ryan Carter a question. She said it quietly and without performance, in the same direct tone she used for everything that mattered. She asked whether he would be willing to build something with her. Not a project, not a professional arrangement, but a life, in whatever shape that could take between two people as different as they were. She said she was not certain it would be easy. She said she was certain that she had not asked anyone this before, and that she would not ask it again. Ryan sat with the question for a long time. He thought about the morning in the parking garage, which he had never considered remarkable, and which had, apparently, changed everything. He thought about the 7 years, about Sophie, about the shop that was being rebuilt and would be finished by spring. He thought about the evenings in the conference room and the night in the flooded shop, and the particular quality of being known by someone who had watched him carefully before deciding to trust him. He thought about how long it had been since anyone had looked at him the way Madison Sterling was looking at him now, not as a credential or a liability or a case to be managed, but as a person who was exactly what he appeared to be, and for whom that was enough. He said yes, he said it the way he said most things, plainly without theater as a statement of fact. The months that followed were not simple, but they were not supposed to be. Ryan and Madison moved carefully, as two people do when what they are building matters too much to be built carelessly. Victor Sterling, who was not a sentimental man, observed the change in his daughter with the satisfaction of someone who has spent decades being right about difficult things and can afford, occasionally, to be surprised by a good outcome. He invited Ryan to lunch twice in the first month, and on the second occasion he asked several questions about the logistics management systems at Carter Mechanical that were, Ryan suspected, not entirely casual. The elder Sterling was still in his 70s, a man who thought in terms of operational efficiency, and Ryan answered his questions with the same attention he gave to everything else. The rebuild of the shop was completed 4 months after the flood, with 2 additional bays and a small glass-walled office that had been designed to Sophie's specifications because she had requested it. The shop looked nothing like what it had been, which Ryan had initially resisted, and which was now, he admitted, considerably better. Madison began to learn, in the patient way she learned everything, that happiness was not a liability. It had always presented itself to her as a thing that would cost her something she could not afford: her clarity, her credibility, the armor of focused competence that had allowed her to function in a world that had spent most of her life looking at her primarily as her father's daughter. What she discovered, gradually and then with increasing conviction, was that the qualities she had assumed were opposed. Warmth and rigor, openness and strength, were not in fact incompatible. Ryan Carter did not require her to be smaller. He simply sat beside her in the ordinary way of someone who is not going anywhere, and she found that this was, in itself, a sufficiency she had not known she needed. Together they established a small fund through the Sterling Holdings Foundation, underwritten by proceeds from a settlement recovered from Brooks and the 2 board members in the subsequent civil action. The fund's purpose was narrow and specific. It provided emergency financial support to people who had experienced sudden income disruption, job loss, medical crisis, the kind of ground-giving-way moment that Ryan Carter had survived in a hospital parking lot 11 years before, and that he knew from personal experience required only a small intervention at the right moment to prevent an irreversible cascade. Madison ran the fund's governance structure with the same rigor she brought to everything. Ryan sat on the advisory board. In the second year of the fund's operation, they received a letter from a man in his early 40s, a warehouse logistics supervisor from the eastern part of the state, who had received a grant during a period of medical hardship and written to thank whoever was responsible. He said that the money had not changed his life by itself, but that it had given him enough time to change it himself. Ryan read the letter twice and then passed it across the table to Madison without comment. She read it and was quiet for a moment, and then she looked at him with the expression of someone who has stopped being surprised by the accuracy of her own best instincts. A man had driven to a mansion one rainy evening to repay a debt he had been carrying for 7 years. The debt had been settled, not in any way that could be recorded in a ledger, but in the only way that actually mattered, through the accumulation of ordinary integrity over time, the kind that does not announce itself, but that other people, if they are paying attention, eventually come to recognize and to trust. Ryan Carter had gone to the Sterling estate to close a chapter. What he found there in a sitting room with an envelope on a low table between two chairs was not a closing but a beginning, the particular kind that arrives late and quiet and without warning, and that turns out, in the end, to be the one that counts.